Well, it's great to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. Now, today we're going to be doing part 3 and reviewing the pre-wrath view of the rapture. Now, again, I want to begin by mentioning that I really do have a strong affinity for a lot of my pre-wrath brothers and sisters. Again, these people are premillennial. They believe that the rapture happens prior to the wrath of God. They take the promises of God seriously, and they have a very high view of predictive prophecy. And so, as I take issue with my brothers and sisters in the pre-wrath movement, I want you to know again that I have a very high view of their different eschatological position. I just happen to disagree. So with that, let me just have you recall that there was 3 big problems that I laid out regarding the pre-wrath view. The first one is that pre-wrath claims the 70th week. Remember, the 70th week is this last 7 years. Oops, let me pull up my pointer. The last 7 years that will occur in human history prior to the millennial kingdom. There's going to be what's called the 70th week of Daniel, from Daniel 9:24 through 27. And what the pre-wrath claims is that this time period will actually be less than the full 7 years, based on Matthew 24:21 through 22. A couple of messages ago, I explained why that's not likely. And the main reason, as we focus on the last 3.5 years, is Antichrist is depicted in Revelation 13:5 is reigning for 42 months. That's the last 3.5 years. Therefore, how can it be cut short less than that if in fact he's reigning for that 3.5 year period? Okay, now let me come to the second big problem with pre-wrath. We looked at this last time. Pre-wrath claims the Great Tribulation is cut short by the day of the Lord. So remember, the Great Tribulation begins at the midpoint, the 3.5 year mark, and it's the worst time period ever. We know that from Matthew 24:21, that what will come upon the world will be such tribulation such as never occurred nor ever will. From that phraseology, we can deduce that, yes, this is the worst time period ever. The problem with the pre-wrath view is they cut short the Great Tribulation with the day of the Lord sometime in the last 3.5 years. Well, the day of the Lord is the worst time period ever. So the worst time period is being cut short by the worst time period. It's irrational. It doesn't make any sense. Now today, we're going to show that pre-wrath claims God's wrath is not present in the first 6 seals. I'll be proving, hopefully to your satisfaction biblically, that indeed wrath is present from the inception of the 70th week of Daniel. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's get started. Let's talk about this disagreement over the timing of God's wrath that we have with the pre-wrath view. Again, pre-wrath claims that God's wrath is not present during the first 6 seals. The first 6 seals, they would agree, really begin at the inception of the 70th week and extend probably to around the midpoint. Okay, so the pre-tribulational view claims that God's wrath is present throughout all the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments. In other words, God's wrath extends from the beginning all the way to the end of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, that's what we would believe. Now, one of the key texts that I think we have to wrestle with when we wanted to determine, is God's wrath present at the beginning of the 70th week? Or is it present only in the last 3.5 years, as the pre-wrath view claims? What we have to discern is, when does the day of the Lord begin? I, as a pre-tribulational proponent, believe the day of the Lord begins at the inception of the 70th week of Daniel. I believe that the rapture occurs, and at the opening of the seal judgments, you have the wrath of God clearly poured out. In fact, in Revelation chapter 4 and 5, you have a throne room scene, and every time in the throne room, let me back up, in the throne room, you'll see a storm theophany. You'll see earthquake, you'll see hail, you'll see thunder and lightning, that sort of thing. The same type of manifestation that you would have seen on Mount Sinai. Now, why is that important? Because it shows us this is the very throne room of God. Well, why that's important is because after the throne room in Revelation 4 through 5, the rest of the book of Revelation, all the way to chapter 19, focuses on the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls. At each 7, they open up to the next 7. In other words, the 7th seal opens up to the 7 trumpets. The 7th trumpet opens up to the 7 bowls. The reason I'm laboring that is that each 7, the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet, the 7th bowl, you have storm theophany, lightning, peals of thunder, earthquake, etc. Why? Because it's linking you back to the throne room. Why is that important? It shows you that yes, all of the seals, all of the trumpets, and all of the bowls is in fact the wrath of God. All of those are the wrath of God proceeding from the throne room of God. That's what I want you to see. So what I'm going to show you is that the day of the Lord does not begin sometime in the last 3.5 years, as the Prewrath claims, but rather the day of the Lord starts here. And therefore, remember, the day of the Lord is associated with God's wrath. So let's begin by looking at 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-3, a text I've showed many of you many times. But let's dig in and make 4 observations regarding this text. Notice, first of all, he says, "For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape." Dear ones, this text is very significant to our understanding of the day of the Lord. Notice 4 observations. First of all, the day of the Lord comes just like a thief. In fact, a thief in the night. Okay, now, the thief here, remember I mentioned that there were 2 terms that John could have used, or I'm sorry, not John, but Paul could have used here, we're in 1 Thessalonians, to refer to a thief. That is kleptes, or he could have used leistes. Well, leistes is a robber that uses force. Kleptes is a thief that uses stealth. The reason I mention that is because kleptes is used, the idea of the day of the Lord coming like a thief is the idea that it comes without warning. Okay, now why does that help prove the pre-tribulational view? Well, because the 70th week of Daniel comes without warning. In other words, life will be going on as it always has in the church age, and all of a sudden you'll see the sudden destruction of the wars that will occur at the inception of the 70th week of Daniel. I'll be talking about those wars in a bit. Think about for a moment, if you're pre-wrath, you believe the day of the Lord doesn't happen until sometime in the last 3.5 years. Well, the problem with that is that the 4th seal, which even they would agree occurs sometime in the first 3.5 years, you have a death of 1/4 of the world's population due to sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. The warfare is so severe that it leads to famine. The famine is so severe it leads to pestilence, and pestilence is so bad that people are being killed even by wild beasts. That is a major sign. When you lose 1/4 of the Earth's population due to that type of warfare and associated events after the warfare, that's bad. Remember in World War II, we lost 3% of the world's population. This is going to be 8 times worse. That's why the opening wars function as signs in the 70th week of Daniel. Remember also, you're going to have the abomination that causes desolation as a mighty sign. So think about all of the signs that you will have, even in the first 3.5 years. How would then, therefore, the day of the Lord come suddenly without warning, like a thief in the night? Does a thief in the night give you a precursor? Do they give you signs? Well, of course not. So the signs that Jesus gives in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24:6, all the way really to around verse 31, those are all in the 70th week of Daniel. Revelation chapter 6 all the way to 19 gives you signs all throughout the 70th week of Daniel. So if you're inside the 70th week of Daniel, you have tons of signs that will tip you off if in fact the day of the Lord happened here as Prewrath claims. Therefore, Prewrath cannot be correct because the day of the Lord would not come without warning and suddenly like a thief in the night. Okay? Second observation, notice that the day of the Lord, according to Paul, says it happens while they're saying peace and safety. Who's the they? Well, it's the unregenerate. Notice they're claiming they have peace and safety. Well, as I'm going to be showing you, at the opening of the 2nd seal, peace is removed from the earth. That's at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. So think about after the 2nd seal is opened, right at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel, there's no peace. Okay, so you can't be saying peace and safety when there's no peace and safety. That's what I would claim. All right, I'll talk more about that in just a bit. So notice here, the pre-wrath view says the day of the Lord and the wrath comes here. Well, how could you be saying peace and safety when you've gone through the worst warfare the world has ever seen? Well, it doesn't make any sense. Of course, you're not going to be saying peace and safety when you lose a quarter of the earth's population due to warfare. That's Revelation 6:8. That's the fourth seal. At the second seal, the Bible is very clear, Revelation chapter 6, verses 3 through 4, that peace has been removed. Okay, that's at the inception, the beginning of the 70th week. Okay, let me give you a third observation. Notice here that the destruction will come suddenly. Okay, well, if the destruction were to come suddenly, that would mean it would happen at the beginning of the 70th week, not sometime in the last 3.5 years. Why? Because the church age is relative normalcy. And by the way, as I say that, I know a lot of horrific things happened. We have all known about World War II. Most of us are old enough to know that that was probably the most horrific warfare that the world had ever encountered. Think about some of the bombing of Dresden. You know, thousands and thousands of people died. What, 100,000? Think about the bombing of Tokyo, the firebombing. Over 100,000 died then. This is without even the atomic bomb. Okay, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Think about the devastation, and yet all of the devastation led to the death of 3% of the population. The opening wars in the labor pains of the 70th week of Daniel is going to lead to the death of a quarter of the earth, 25%. It's 8 times worse than what we saw in World War II. So again, you can't be saying that this is sudden. You could be saying that the destruction is sudden if it happens here, but you can't be saying it's sudden if you've been through that terrible destruction if Prewrath is claiming it's here. How can you go through the worst warfare the world has ever seen and all of a sudden come some 3.5, 4, 5 years later and say that that's sudden destruction? No, you've been seeing destruction for years. Okay, so again, that doesn't make any sense. That's again why the day of the Lord and the associated wrath has to happen at the beginning of the 70th week. Notice also the fourth observation is not only does the wrath come suddenly, it comes like labor pains. Now this term here that you see, odin, in the Greek, really is borrowed from Jesus' teaching in Matthew 24, I believe if I recall it's verse 8, where Jesus says these are the beginning of odin labor pains or birth pains. So this is where pre-wrath and pre-trib agree. We all agree that the labor pains are within the first 3.5 years. Well, notice that the day of the Lord comes suddenly like labor pains. Okay, if you know a pregnancy, my wife, when she had our baby boy, she was sitting with me watching a movie and all of a sudden her water broke. And suddenly labor pains came upon her. And as the labor pains progress, they get worse and worse and worse. And finally, you have the birth of your child. Well, that's exactly the conception that the Jews had of this last 7 years. That it would begin like labor pains. And yes, the beginning of the labor pains are painful, but it gets worse and worse and worse until what is birthed is the Messianic age. Dear ones, even Prewrath agrees that the beginning of the birth pains are at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. What does the day of the Lord come like? Well, it's like the beginning of labor pains. Why do I add the beginning? Because it's sudden. It's suddenly like labor pains. Dear ones, you can't say this would be sudden like labor pains here. Why? Well, because again, you've seen the worst warfare. Some of the signs that you see, for example, in the 6th seal, even the unregenerate, in the opening seal judgments and the labor pains, they even know it's the wrath of God upon them. I'll be showing you that later. So again, labor pains shows us that indeed the wrath begins at the beginning of the 70th week, because that's the beginning of the labor pains that come suddenly and they progressively get worse until the birth of the Messiah comes, the Messianic age. Okay? So again, for those 4 reasons, I think 1 Thessalonians 5, 2 through 3 really shows us that the 70th week of Daniel, the beginning of it, is indeed where the day of the Lord begins, not in the last 3.5 years, as Prewrath claims. Okay? Now, let's keep going on. Let's ask ourselves the question, can you have peace when peace is removed? What I want to do is focus on this phrase where the unregenerate are claiming peace and safety. Notice Paul says that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Again, that's without warning. That again shows us at the beginning of the 70th week. while they are saying peace and safety. Again, we have relatively we have, I think, peace and safety during the church age. But as soon as you get into the inception of the 70th week of Daniel, there's no peace and safety. Peace and safety has been removed. Okay, now why do I say that? Well, because the book of Revelation tells us. This is the second seal. The second seal is right at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Notice it says, Revelation 6, 3-4, when he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, Come. And another, a red horse, went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. I just realized my microphone is a little ways away. I'm going to try to move it a little closer here. Let's see if I can get, there we go. Now, dear ones, what I want you to see here is notice at the second seal it was granted to take what? It was granted to take peace away from the earth. Well, again, that happens at the opening of the seal judgments. This is the second seal. Well, how can you be saying peace and safety when there's no peace and safety? That's what I'm showing you. So the only time that people can be saying peace and safety is at the inception, the very beginning of the 70th week. Why? Because you're just coming out of the church age. Then all of a sudden destruction comes upon them. There's going to be warfare like the world has never seen. Now, one of the ways I've seen certain pre-wrath scholars try to get out of this quandary is they will say, well, yeah, but notice it says it was granted this authority to take peace from the earth. It doesn't mean they actually use that type of authority. Well, I think it is. I think anytime you see granted or authority given, indeed, that's what happens. That event here, taking peace from the earth, indeed will occur. Again, how can you say peace and safety when you have no peace and safety? That means the beginning of the 70th week is the beginning of wrath. The day of the Lord is the time period of God's wrath. It happens, the beginning of it, while people are saying peace and safety. How could you be saying peace and safety anywhere in the first 3.5 years, since the warfare is so bad it leads to a death of 1/4 of the Earth's population, 8 times worse than what we saw in World War II? Well, of course you can't be saying peace and safety then. Of course, it's not sudden destruction that comes upon the world after the worst warfare. But you could be saying peace and safety at the inception of the 70th week. Why? Because you've just come out of the church age. All right, so again, dear ones, remember, I believe the rapture occurs. Remember, Prewrath also believes that the rapture occurs, then you have the day of the Lord. We believe the same as pre-tribulational proponents. We just believe that it happens here. So the rapture occurs, the people of God are removed, then God's wrath is poured out. And yes, God does use the nations as instruments of his wrath. I'll show you that later from Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5. Okay? All right. Now, let's move on. I want to show you again that the day of the Lord comes like labor pains. Let me make this connection more clear. Again, 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-3, we're talking about the day of the Lord. Of course, associated with that is God's wrath. Notice it comes like labor pains. Again, the term in Greek is odin. It's borrowed right from Jesus. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 24, 6-8. He says, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. Now stop there. What are these wars and rumors of wars? Well, they're the wars that are going to be happening in the opening years, the opening 3.5 years of the 70th week of Daniel. Just as we looked at earlier from the second seal, that peace is removed from the earth. So notice Jesus in Matthew 24, 6-8 is then teaching the same thing that we see in the opening seal judgments in Revelation 6. What can we conclude from that? Well, I think we can conclude then that the 70th week of Daniel is described in both Revelation 6-19 and also in Matthew 24, really verses 4 all the way to verse 31. At least those are the sign passages. Okay? All right, and so notice he says, you'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Here, the end that he's referring to is actually the end of the 70th week. Now, how can I be so confident? Because 9 verses later, Jesus does recapitulation. He goes all the way to the end of the tribulation period. But in Revelation chapter, Matthew 24:15, Jesus brings you back to the midpoint. And he says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet, let the reader understand. Why am I laboring that? What I'm trying to show you is a lot of people think, well, the end is simply the end of the world. That is, we're living in the church age and things get worse and worse. These wars and rumors of wars, those are things that have always happened, and we're in the church age, but all of a sudden the end comes. Well, that's the 70th week of Daniel. That is not, I believe, how Jesus describes this. The wars Jesus is referring to are the worst wars that have ever occurred. That's why they function as signs. Listen clearly to me. The reason these are signs is because they lead to a death of a quarter of the earth, 8 times worse than what you saw in World War II. That's how bad it is. And remember, World War II was the worst warfare that the world has ever seen. It led to a death of 3% of the entire world's population. These wars are going to lead to a death of 25% of the world's population. Okay, so that's why he says, for nation will rise against nation. There's going to be worldwide warfare and kingdom against kingdom in various places, and there will be famines and earthquakes. Well, lo and behold, we know from the 4th seal that there's going to be famines. In fact, the famines are a result of the severe warfare. Notice Jesus says, but all of these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. That's the same term that Paul later uses. If you looked at it in Greek, it would be odin. Odin. Labor pains. Where do labor pains begin? Well, even the Prewrath position agrees that the beginning of the labor pains happens at the inception of the 70th week. Well, notice the day of the Lord in its wrath comes suddenly like labor pains. Therefore, if you have labor pains at the inception of the 70th week, that's the beginning of the day of the Lord. If that's the day of the Lord, well, then you know the wrath of God is poured out from the beginning of the 70th week. That would be the logic that I would use. Okay? All right. Let's keep going for the sake of time. The beginning of labor pains will kill a quarter of the earth. Let's focus on that for just a moment. Revelation 6:8, this is the 4th seal. Again, this is sometime in the first 3.5 years. And again, the warfare just gets worse and worse and worse, and it leads to famine, pestilence, and even wild beasts killing the world. Notice Revelation 6:8. John says, I looked and behold an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death. And Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beasts of the earth. Now, dear ones, notice how many are going to die? Well, a fourth of the earth. Now, again, this is a place where Prewrath will try to get away from the, really, to me, the clear meaning of the text. They'll say, well, authority was given to these personified writers, Death and Hades. But that doesn't mean that this actually occurs. In other words, they'll say authority is given to kill a fourth of the earth, but that doesn't mean the authority is exercised. I think that that's a bogus reading. Anytime authority is given, whether it's to the beast, the Antichrist, or in this case to Death and Hades, these personified writers, indeed it is taken. What John is trying to convey is that a fourth of the earth is going to die due to sword, that's warfare, due to famine. The warfare is so bad that people are going to starve. They can no longer produce food. And the starvation will be so bad that people are opened up to disease, that's pestilence. And people are so weakened from the warfare, the lack of eating, and then disease, that even the wild beasts of the earth will kill them. Okay? Now, the beasts of the earth is a very significant phrase here. And there's actually some disagreement with the Prewrath view on this. They believe the beasts of the earth is actually a reference to the Antichrist and his forces, and I'll explain why they believe that. However, I'll be showing you that no, the wild beasts are just that. They're beasts of the earth. And what God is showing, in fact, is that you have an unraveling of the design of creation. Remember, in the opening 9 chapters, really, if you want to really broaden out Genesis a little bit, we see that God has given dominion of the earth to man. So in other words, in the opening chapters of Genesis, just think about the first 3, you clearly see man has dominion over the beast. Well, now you see an unraveling of the creation order where beasts start having dominion again over man. Why? Because of the warfare, the famine, the pestilence has so weakened people. Okay, so that's how bad it's going to be in the opening 3.5 years. Well, of course, this is the worst time period ever. Okay, of course, these are wars then like we've never seen. And so these labor pains indeed are the wrath of God. Why do we know that it's the wrath of God? Because the sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beast was the wrath of God poured out by God on unbelieving Judah because of the rebellion. We know that because of Ezekiel chapter 14. Again, this phrase authority was given. Prewrath will say, well, that just means that there's authority given to these personified riders, but it doesn't mean they actually exercise that authority. That's nonsense. Authorial intent would have us know that the authority given, the implied here is that it's a divine passive. God is the one who's giving the authority, and therefore, because it's a divine passive, God is the one who has decreed that a fourth of the earth will die. God uses means at his disposal for his wrath, whether it's human agency, whether it's pestilence, what have you. Okay? Now again, I want you to see this allusion to Ezekiel chapter 14, but I first want to read to you from Alan Kirshner's book. And by the way, I'm going to cite Alan Kirshner. I think he's really a gifted scholar, far better than I think Marv Rosenthal, and I don't mean any disrespect to him, but Alan Kirshner is a very good student of Scripture. So I'm going to cite him because I always want to cite the best minds from the opposing views. And again, I have a lot in common with Alan Kirshner. I just disagree with him on some of these points. Notice what he says regarding the wild beast. He says, since it refers to the Antichrist and his associations. By the way, let me explain. What Kirshner is pointing out is that every time you see, I think it's like 39 times the term therion for beast, he says it always refers to the Antichrist and its associations in the remaining 38 instances. It would be very unusual, though not impossible, for it not to refer to Antichrist and his religious associations here as well. Now, what Alan Kirshner is claiming then is he believes the beast of the earth is a reference to the Antichrist. Now, why would Kirshner be predisposed to see that? Well, again, I'm not trying to claim he's being biased, but perhaps bias is playing into this a little bit because they believe that the opening seal judgments are the wrath of the Antichrist, not of Christ. Now remember, that's very doubtful because Revelation chapter 4 through 5, you have what? The throne room. Then you have the 7 seals, 7 bowls, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls. Each 7, you have storm theophany that links you back. So in other words, at the 7th seal, storm theophany. 7th trumpet, storm theophany. 7th bowl, storm theophany. Why? It links you back to the storm theophany in Revelation chapter 4 through 5, the throne room. Why? Because all of it's coming from the throne, from Christ. So this is the wrath of Christ, not Antichrist. And so what I'm claiming is the wild beasts are, yes, they're just regular beasts. They're animals. Coyote, wolves, bear, that sort of animal. Okay? That's what I'm claiming. But Kirshner is saying, no, this is actually a reference to the Antichrist. Okay? Now, let me show you why I don't think that that's the case at all. Let me show you why the beasts are in fact wild animals. Again, what we're debating is this phrase, the wild beasts of the earth. First of all, I would point that this is a clear allusion to Ezekiel 14:19 through 21. Remember, there's 404 verses in the book of Revelation. 278 of them contain direct allusions back to the Old Testament. In fact, some of the verses in Revelation, if they were not allusions back to the Old Testament, we would have no idea what John is talking about. So, for example, in Revelation chapter 12, you see a reference to the woman with the moon and the stars. Well, we know that's a reference back to Genesis 37. It's a reference to Joseph's dream. So we know, therefore, that the woman is Israel. Well, unless John made that allusion back to Genesis 37, you'd have no idea what he's talking about. So what I'm claiming is that this is a direct allusion to Ezekiel 14:21. Why? It's almost word for word the same in the Greek Septuagint of Ezekiel 14:21, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, as it is to Revelation 6:8 at the end here. Okay, so notice what God said. This would come upon Judah. He says, or if I should send a plague against the country and pour out my wrath in blood on it to cut off man and beast from it. And then he goes on to talk about in verse 20, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job are in the midst, They can only deliver themselves by their righteousness. Why? Because there's such great unrighteousness in Judah because of their idolatry. He goes on to verse 21. He says, "For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send my 4 severe judgments against Jerusalem, sword," notice sword, famine, wild beasts, plague, that's the same as pestilence. So notice you have the identical 4 plagues that were poured upon Judah because of God's wrath poured out upon them. Now, how do we know it's God's wrath? Because God tells us it's his wrath. That's how we know. Ezekiel 14:19, I'm not some genius. God says it's instruments of his wrath. So here's the question, dear ones. Why was it the wrath of God when he poured it upon Judah during their judgment because of their idolatry? But now, in the 70th week of Daniel, all of a sudden it's not God's wrath? Why? Because pre-wrath proponents don't want it to be? That's nonsense. Dear ones, the wild beast is a clear reference to the wild beast of Ezekiel 14:21. It is not a reference to the Antichrist. So what's being stated then at the 4th seal is the wrath of God is so severe you're going to lose 1/4 of the earth's population in the opening 3.5 years. Okay, why is that an important thing to think about? Because Paul says the day of the Lord comes while they're saying peace and safety. Well, that means it must happen at the inception of the 70th week. Can you say you have peace and safety after you lose 1/4 of the earth's population due to sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts? Try to claim that to someone. Say, hey, we just lost 25% of the earth's population. We must have peace and safety. Okay, can you say sudden destruction comes upon the world after you've just lost 1/4 of the earth's population? No, it must happen prior. That's what shows us that the wrath of God is beginning at the inception of the 70th week. Now, I don't want to get off track. Let me keep giving you further evidence why we know the wild beasts, in fact, are not a reference to the Antichrist and the associates like the false prophet, etc., but are in fact actual wild beasts as alluded to in Ezekiel 14:21. Do you remember, again, Revelation 6:8, John is referring to these wild beasts. I want you to recall that in Revelation 13:1, he talks about Satan. So John sees this dragon, which is Satan. It says, stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. Now, who's the beast? That's the Antichrist. Now, notice, is the Antichrist depicted as coming out of the earth or of the earth? No, he's depicted as coming up out of the sea. Why? Because the sea to the Jews is a symbol of the abyss. Sometimes it's also, and it's not, it doesn't mean that it's, you can't have both, but it's also a symbol of the nations as well. Okay, so in other words, you don't have to pick whether it's a symbol of the nations or the abyss, because the nations are depicted as being run by satanic and demonic forces. So my point is, here you have John depicting the beast coming up out of the sea. Well, here, if in fact the Antichrist was being depicted, it would be the wild beast out of the sea. But you don't have that. It's the wild beasts of the earth. Why? Because these are just regular animals that come from the earth. Okay, they're just like wolves, different animals that will pillage humankind. Why? Because humankind has been so devastated and weakened by warfare, famine, and disease. And again, it's an unraveling of the created order. That's what you're seeing. So again, what I would do is take issue with Alan Kirshner on this point and say, no, more than likely the wild beasts here are a reference to Ezekiel 14:21, and indeed they're actual animals. It's not a reference to Antichrist. Okay? So therefore, yes, this is really, just as it was God's wrath back in Ezekiel 14:19 through 21, it's really the wrath of God in the opening of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay? All right, so let's keep moving on. What's interesting is when you get to the 6th seal, even unbelievers, you know, I'm looking at my screen, and I don't know if it's going to come out this way to you guys, but I'm actually looking inverted. I'm upside down. So I just want to assure you I'm not doing aerobatics in my chair here. I'm a pilot, but I'm not doing aerobatics. I'm still straight and level, but we'll continue on here. I think that must be a glitch in my system. Notice here, this is the 6th seal, Revelation chapter 6. Now, there's some tremendous wrath that comes upon the unregenerate in the sixth seal and really severe earthquake. Notice what it says, Revelation 6:16 through 17. It says, and they said to the mountains, these are the unregenerate, and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? What I want you to see here is that even at the sixth seal, the unregenerate know that the wrath of God is upon them. Why? They're claiming that this is the wrath of the Lamb, which is the wrath of Christ. Okay, and notice they say in verse 17, for the great day, this is a reference to the day of the Lord, the great day of their wrath has come. Okay, what I'm claiming is this is happening sometime in the first part of the 70th week of Daniel, that is in the first 3.5 years. Notice they even know that the wrath has come. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to take focus of this phrase, has come. That's a verb. It's actually an aorist. It's an aorist active indicative form of erchomai. And all I want you to realize is that there's a debate between pre-wrath and pre-trib. The pre-wrath proponent says this is an ingressive aorist. An ingressive aorist simply means that it's about to begin or it's just beginning. So what they try to do is they claim, well, the unregenerate realize that the wrath is just beginning. That's how they would understand the aorist. And to be fair, that is a possible reading of the aorist. However, what I would claim in the pre-tribulational view is what's called a constative aorist. And it simply means a past action. Why that's important is, think about this is in the first 3.5 years. All I have to do is to prove that the wrath of God is present and recognized in the first 3.5 years to disprove the pre-wrath view. Why? Because they believe wrath is only found sometime in the last 3.5 years. Are you with me? So that's why the pre-wrath movement has to say, well, this aorist is actually an ingressive, because they know that the sixth seal is happening probably sometime in the first 3.5 years. Remember, they don't believe that wrath occurs until after this seal. So therefore, if we can prove that no, even the unregenerate realize that the wrath has come past tense, then we've just proven the pre-wrath view wrong. That's why this matters so much. Now, why am I so confident in the pre-tribulation view that this is a constative aorist, simply denoting past action? Meaning that even the unregenerate realize that what they've witnessed in the opening seals is in fact the wrath of God? Well, because that's the default position of the aorist. Okay, so without some contextual clue, we shouldn't be saying, well, it's an ingressive. We should just say, yeah, it's more than likely a constative aorist. Here's from the GMSDT. What is that? Well, that is the Glossary of Morphosyntactic Database Terminology, of course. What a silly question. You probably think, wow, I'm so silly of asking what that was. Well, that's what this is, and I'm going to give you the definition of the aorist. It says the aorist verb tense is used by the writer to present the action of a verb as a snapshot event. Let me explain why that's important. We in the Greek language, we talk about it being an aspectual language. There's something called action sart. And so in Greek verbs, they have not only tense, but the focus of the Greek verb is actually whether you have ongoing action, whether something is depicted as once and for all, that sort of idea. And so in the different tenses, you can kind of glean whether the action is ongoing, whether it's been completed, etc. Well, what this author is saying of the GMSDT, the Glossary of Morphosyntactic Database Terminology, is that the aorist is just very generic. It just simply gives you a snapshot. And it often shows the verb action is portrayed simply and in summary fashion without respect to any process. In other words, it's not like a present tense. Present tense in Greek has to do not just something that's occurring now, but the focus is on ongoing action. Okay, that's the idea. And again, I'm looking at my camera view and I look upside down and I have no idea why that is, but I hope it doesn't look that way to you. I will only know when I go to view the video myself. Okay, now let's keep reading this though. Notice it says in the indicative mood, the aorist usually denotes past time. Okay, well that's what we're claiming with the constative aorist. While an aorist participle, which we don't have here, usually refers to antecedent time, which would be past time, with respect to the main verb. outside the indicative, and the participle, the aorist, does not indicate time. So do we have an indicative mood here? Yes, we have an aorist active indicative. Okay, third person singular, if I recall, because it's referring back to the day. The day has come, and it just denotes that it's actually the day of their wrath. Why am I laboring that? Because more than likely we're right with a constant of aorist. It's past action. Why does that matter? That means that the sixth seal, they're looking backwards at past action, saying, yeah, this is the wrath of God. They're not looking forward to something that's about to begin. They're looking backwards. Are you with me? What that means then is, yes, in the first 3.5 years, clearly even the unregenerate realize this is the wrath of God. Dear brothers and sisters, I think that the case that the wrath of God has come upon the world in the first 3.5 years is devastating. That's why I, in good conscience, couldn't hold to any other view. What I really appreciate about those who are pre-wrath proponents is they take seriously the promises of God that we will be exempt from the wrath of God. I love that about my dear brothers and sisters who are pre-wrath. The only thing we really disagree about is when does that wrath come. Today, I hope I've really proven to you, because it's in my mind, I've proven it to myself, but again, everyone has to do you. You have to see the data as you see fit, but I believe that indeed it's overwhelming that the wrath of God is present within the first 3.5 years. Therefore, what? We have to be removed prior to that. That's what drives me toward the pre-tribulational rapture. Okay? All right. Now, again, God's wrath is at the beginning of the 70th week. Let me just give you some summary here. The day of the Lord comes suddenly while the earth is saying peace and safety. According to Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5:3, peace is removed by the second seal. So what I'm driving at is we know peace is removed. By the way, I'm looking at my camera now. I'm not upside down. I have no idea what that was all about. But again, I'm claiming the wrath of God is clearly present at the inception of the 70th week. Why? Because peace is removed by the second seal. Okay, well, how can you be saying peace and safety when you have no peace and safety? The only time you could say peace and safety is at the very, very beginning, right? So again, during the church age, it's going to be relative peace and safety compared to what you have in the opening seal judgments of the 70th week of Daniel. So you could be saying peace and safety here, but not after. Why? Because peace has been removed by the second seal. That shows us the day of the Lord's wrath begins at the inception of the 70th week. Number 2, the day of the Lord comes suddenly like a thief, meaning without warning. Well, this doesn't make any sense after years of warfare and signs. How can you say that it's come suddenly upon you after more than 3.5 years of all the signs, warfare? You have signs literally all the way through Matthew 24, the signs of Revelation chapter 6 all the way to 19. How can you be saying that it's suddenly if you're somehow claiming this happens in the last 3.5 years? Okay, it doesn't make any sense. It's not sudden at all, like a thief. Number 3, the sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts were means of God's wrath according to Ezekiel 14:19-21 on Judah. Why not in Revelation 6:8? Okay, remember, dear ones, the 70th week of Daniel is a reversal of Israel's fortunes. What he used to pour upon the world as far as wrath, he's now going to, in the Old Testament, what God used to pour upon Israel as far as wrath, he is now going to pour upon the world. Are you with me? So he took sword, famine, pestilence, wild beast. It was his wrath. Ezekiel 14:19, he poured it upon Judah in the 586 BC destruction of Jerusalem. Now we're seeing that that's poured upon the world during the 70th week of Daniel, in particular in the opening 3.5 years. So the question is, isn't it special pleading for some pre-wrath proponent to say, okay, yes, it was certainly the wrath of God on Judah, but it would never be the wrath of God on the unregenerate world? Why? Why isn't it? I think it's special pleading. Number 4, even unbelievers know that they've been experiencing the wrath of God, again, the 6th seal. Remember, the aorist in the indicative normally refers to action that occurred in the past. Remember, they say the wrath has come. Revelation 6:17, they're looking backwards. It's past tense. Okay, so they even recognize what they've witnessed is the wrath of God. For these reasons, I think clearly the wrath of God is present throughout the entirety of the 70th week of Daniel. since we've been promised exemption from the wrath of God, 1 Thessalonians 5:9, 1 Thessalonians 1:10, from Revelation 3:10, from Luke 17:16 through 35, Matthew 24:40 through 41. Certainly, we have to be taken out prior to this. Remember, Jesus says in Luke 17, I think around verses 30 through 35, or I'm sorry, yeah, it's around verses 29 to 30, Lot was removed, then the wrath came. Okay, Noah was removed, then the wrath came. That's also in Luke 17 and also in Matthew 24. The precedent Jesus gives us is that the people of God were removed, then the wrath comes. All we have to figure out the timing of the rapture is, when does the wrath come? Well, it becomes apparent, I think, when you look at the data. The wrath of God comes at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Therefore, we have to be removed at the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, that's the case, I think, in short, for the pre-trib rapture. All right, now let me hit a few issues here. We'll close on this slide. God uses the nations as instruments of his wrath. Many times, good friends of mine who are in the pre-wrath movement, they will say, Eric, don't you know that the nations and Antichrist, they're pouring out their wrath, but that's not the wrath of God? What I would say back to that is, God often uses pagan nations as instruments of his wrath. For example, let me give you a clear case of that. Here, Isaiah 10:5, we see Assyria is being used as a vessel of God's wrath. Notice what God says. He says, woe to Assyria. He's going to judge them. Okay, they're not going to get off the hook, and yet they're going to be used by God. Okay, when was Assyria used by God, by the way? In the 722 BC destruction of the northern 10 tribes of Israel. Okay, so remember, that's where we lose the northern 10 tribes. You end up getting Samaritans from that, the area of Samaria, based on this judgment, right? Well, notice God is pronouncing judgment upon Assyria. He says, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, meaning they're the rod. Who's the rod? Assyria is of what? Of God's anger. That's synonymous with wrath. You could literally say the rod of my wrath. Notice he says, and what? The staff in whose hand is my indignation. Who is the indignation of God? Assyria. They're a weapon being used by God. Indignation, again, is another synonym to wrath. So you have synonymous parallelism. Anger and indignation is instruments of wrath. Who is that? Assyria. So God was using a pagan nation as instruments of his wrath. By the way, we see the same thing in Matthew 24, I believe. Why? Because remember, this is the wrath of God being poured out. It's the beginning of what? Labor pains. Labor pains is associated with the day of the Lord. How do we know that? Because Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:2 through 3. So labor pains are associated with what? Wars and rumors of wars, right? Well, where do the wars come from? Well, nations in the opening 3.5 years. They're being used as instruments of God's wrath. Okay, so yes, God is using the nations. We see it also in Revelation chapter 6. Notice it says, another red horse went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth. Why? Because you're going to have wars and rumors of wars. Why? Because God uses nations, even pagan nations like Assyria, as instruments of his wrath. Okay? Remember, the day of the Lord comes while they're saying peace and safety. Well, you can't have peace and safety after the beginning of the 70th week. Why? Because peace has been removed from the earth. All right? Let me give you one more. Revelation 17:17. This is regarding the nations, the 10 horns that give their allegiance to Antichrist. It says, for God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose, by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God will be fulfilled. Notice, who is running these pagan nations? Who is running the pagan nations? Is it just their idea? Is it the wrath of Satan? Is it the wrath of Antichrist? No, God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose. God is using even the pagan nations who give their allegiance to the beast for his purposes. He uses the nations as instruments of his wrath. Don't let anybody fool you into saying, well, these are in the opening judgments of these nations waging war. That's the wrath of man, or it's the wrath of Antichrist, but it's not the wrath of God. That's bogus. No, certainly God uses the nations. He did with Assyria. He did with Babylon. all of a sudden we get to the 70th week of Daniel and God can't use the nations as instruments of his wrath anymore? Who made up that idea? And again, if you want to understand the book of Revelation, 404 verses, 278 of them contain direct allusions to the Old Testament. The book of Revelation is built on the Old Testament. Therefore, if you see the nations waging war and God giving them, literally put it in their hearts to execute his purpose, you know that God is ultimately the one using these nations as instruments of his wrath. Dear ones, clearly the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel is the beginning of the wrath of God. Therefore, the church has to be removed prior. I wouldn't buy into the idea that no, the wrath of God only occurs sometime in the last 3.5 years. I don't think the data suggests that in any way. Now, dear ones, I hope you have a wonderful week. Again, as I say all these things, and I'm critical of my dear brothers and sisters in the pre-wrath view, I want all those out there who are in the pre-wrath view to take this with love, because we agree on 99.9% of eschatology. But again, I do want to challenge all of you out there. Let the scriptures be the final guide. And again, you have to call balls and strikes for your own theology and eschatology. But again, that's the data as I see it. Anyway, we'll see you next time on End Times with Pastor Eric.